talk to you today about some things that I've learned, that some major changes to WinGAP. A lot of the things that we're going to cover, well, pretty much everything we're going to cover is strictly related to data, so it's really going to get nerdy here. The WinGAP, as you know, is sort of a living entity, I guess. It's constantly getting updated and improved, and back in the day, back when WinGAP first started, it was, when in the late 80s when we had really slow computers, and it was not the greatest camera software in the world, but it was better than nothing. And as more and more counties came on board and the organization had more and more money to work with, they've made more and more improvements. And a couple of things that y'all need to know probably too. Most of you know Tracy Thomas, who was kind of the lead guy with WinGAP after Greg Reese retired. Tracy's retired now. And Department of Revenue has also lost a couple of other people. Mark Lovett, I don't know, I'm sure some of y'all know him. They're down to the point where they've lost everybody that knew anything about GIS. And Rusty Scovin, who used to be with Harris County, has worked with GIS before, but he's been away from it for several years. And he fits into this whole thing a little pretty. I'll explain more about that later on, but he fits into this whole presentation. There are several new fields that are added to WinGAP, and there are going to be a lot of new types of data that are added. These are all to facilitate. 15 fields here are there to facilitate the new method that timber is going to be valued by. I'm sure most of you know how public utilities work. They're assessed by the state, and then the state tells the counties what the values are to send to Georgia Power or to CSX Railroad and those kinds of things. Well, they're kind of following that model with timber now for large timber tracts. Basically, this is in reaction to some legislation that was passed last session that the timber companies were able to get through. They were looking at the large tracts that they had in different counties and saying, well, why is our assessment higher in County A than it is in the adjoining County B? And if they started looking at it, you have different levels of accuracy in the assessment data and the appraisals. So they were saying, well, it's not fair that if County A is not doing as good a job as County B, that we're paying a higher price in County B than we are in County A. So there was there's a lack of uniformity, and I get that. I mean, I think that we all can understand that, one county may have more staff or more competent staff, or they may have the more resources. And of course, appraisals are really just an opinion of value. So what they're doing is they're saying, we want the state to value all this qualifying land. Basically what we're talking about is the union camps and the Georgia Pacifics and the large timber companies. So this is not applying to, Joe Brown, who has 400 acres of timberland. Part of the problem that the counties have in valuing this type of property is just the lack of sales. You don't have that many sales of 1,000-acre timber tracts in any given county. And if they do have a tract that sells with standing timber on it, now if it's cut over land, that's pretty clear. You're just valuing dirt, right? But if it's got standing timber on it, that timber also adds value, and that value is included in the sale price. Well, in the state of Georgia, you can't tax standing timber. It's taxed at the point of harvest. So if they have one of these sales, if they're lucky enough to have a number of these sales, they have to go in and hire somebody that's a timber person that knows how to go in and value that standing timber, and they have to extract that value from the sale price. They're only taxing the bare dirt. So just the lack of data. If you look at this from a regional approach or a statewide approach, you're going to have those sales. If you're looking in an individual county, they'd be lucky to have two maybe. And it's hard to draw conclusions from that. So that leads to Rusty. I mentioned him earlier. Rusty called me and said, look, this has been dumped on me. I'm going to be the guy that values all the timberland for the entire state. And I said, I'm so sorry. And this leads up to, I'm sure some of y'all have probably helped some of your counties with this issue, and if not, you probably have even heard of it. DOR has collected all the parcel data all the GIS parcel data from the entire state with some attributions from the CAMA files. And they're going to be using that information to value these timber tracts. Well, one of the things that they told me also is now that they've collected all this and they've made it a mandatory part of the digest submission, apparently the news has got out. And they're getting a lot of open record requests for data for the whole state. And now they're that was why Rusty called me. He says, do we have to give it to them? And I said, well, I don't know. You need to talk to your lawyer. But there are going to be some new sub-records in the land subs table. I guess some of y'all have at least looked at that land subs DBF file. I'm going to show you how that works here in the next few slides. But what's important to remember is this is not a timber exemption. You know, you have homestead exemptions, you have conservation use exemptions, you have some other forest land protection exemptions. All this does is it's just a different system or a different appraiser looking at the value of these properties. Currently, and this is I don't have any. They haven't expanded some of the things in WinGAP. I'm not even sure what they're going to call these records that are assessed by the state, but they'll have a subtype. So CUV is conservation use. RUR stands for rural land. I'll show you some of these later, but there's also one for residential land, which would be small parcels and subdivisions and that sort of thing. There's going to be a new subtype added. Like I said, I don't know what the abbreviation is going to be, but it's going to be, you know, centralized, state assessed or something. Currently, if you look at these, you're all familiar with the real key as the parcel identifier. We've got 1112 here for the real key for all of these parcels. These are conservation use records. These are the fair market value records. So the acreage is the same, 32.79. And if I go to the conservation use records and calculate the acreage, sum those, then I also have 32.79. With the new state assessed property, you may have all three of these. You may have a part, well, not for large timber, but you may have one that's has an FLP value, which I'll cover that later. That's forest land protection, because these large timber companies are eligible for that exemption. They would also have a fair market value that's assessed by the county, and then there's going to be that additional set of values. So you may have multiple records for the same parcel. You will have multiple records for the same parcel. You'll have the rural value, the forest land protection value, and then the state assessed value. That's important to remember. So if you go in here and just add all these up, right now on this parcel, you would duplicate your acreage, you would duplicate your value. When you add that state assessed, those state assessed sub-records, if you're not aware of the difference in these things, you could easily triple your acreage when you're doing these calculations. Like I said, those records in the example I showed you, they added up to the same acreage, 37 some odd acres. In some counties, they will remove up to 2 acres and put that in a home site. So that 2 acres will be included in your fair market value calculations. Whoops. But it won't be included in the records that are part of the conservation use value calculations. So just be aware of that. Not all counties do that. There was a law passed that basically allowed them to do that, and I think that the wording was may instead of shall. So So now, where do these sub-records come from? So you'd think that, there would be, if it's a 100-acre tract, then you'd just have a record that says 100 acres, but that's not how it works. Any of you that work with the counties on these conservation use records will know that. They take the NRCS soil data and overlay that with the parcels, and then overlay a land cover feature class, so that you end up with 3 different overlaid feature classes. You're going to have a land type, which is going to tell you whether it's open land or woodland. I think 4 is open land in this county. Now they can go in and customize that. So one county you go into, the land type 4 may be open land. The next county you go into, land type 4 may be woodland. They may have them reversed. There's not a standard way to do that. It's not standardized. But there's a way to look that up, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So we take the land type, the land class, which is the productivity of that particular type of soil. You may have a soil that's in a low-lying marshy area that's not as productive as something that's up on higher elevation, is nice and level. And they have different productivity ratings, 1 through 9, for different types of soils. And they've taken tables, they've sat down with some ag economists and here at UGA, some people in the School of Forestry, and they've grouped these things using some sort of, using the expertise of some of these people that know actually something about soil productivity. And they are not the same. So like you may have an ALP soil that's a Class 9 woodland and a Class 7 open land. But if you, and let's say that you're in Southwest Georgia, and that's how they're grouped. But if you go up to another part of the state and you have that same ALP soil type, it may have different productivity classes in that area. So you'll need to get with your counties. You're going to be working with them on this. They can get a list that tells what they've divided the state up in, I think, 9 different or maybe 7 different regions. They call them Kuva districts. Each county can get a list from DOR that says ALP soil in my county is a type 7 woodland and type 9 open land. And you'll need to know that before you come up with these calculations. So what they did is they said, all right, we have these 4 soil types that are Class 4 open land, and they're 37.91 acres total in this parcel. And then they did the same thing with Class 5 woodland, Class 6 woodland, Class 8 woodland, and then calculations for Class 1 open land and Class 2 open land, and these are the acreages that they came up with. All right, so how would you know which one was open land and which one was woodland? In a WinGAP county, there's a table called rural land, and it tells you type 1 is woodland, type 4 is open land in this county. You go to another county and it may look completely different, but this is where you're going to find that information. Now that's just for the fair market value records. So you have land that's in conservation use. They only have 2 types, open land and woodland. They don't have orchards, they don't have ponds, and small tracts, in theory, probably shouldn't be in conservation use anyway because it's an agricultural exemption. But if you notice here, open land is Class 4, just like it is on the rural land table, but timberland is a Class 5 instead of a Class 1. So you've got, it's confusing, but that's the way it was in this particular county. It may look different in another county. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Now, in this forest land protection, FLPA, they'll call it FLIPA when you're talking to the counties. They do the same thing, except they ignore any open land. In other words, they treat open land the same way they do timberland. Let me see if I can explain that a little better. It ignores the land cover, and the parcel is taxed as if it were all timberland using the same 9 classes. So here's the one that has rural values. Those calculate your fair market value, and then FLP values. And as you see, the land type, you have different land types in the fair market value calculations, and you have all ones over here in the forest land protection subtypes. And they've gone to the tables, and when they did that overlay analysis, they completely left off the land cover feature class, and they only overlaid the soils and the parcels to come up with these calculations. And then they used the productivity ratings for the, as if the whole thing was woodland. All right, so now we're not talking about the new stuff just yet. It's all kind of folding in as we go. The new subrecords for timber will work, is my understanding so far, and DOR is still kind of working out some of these details on how they're going to do this. It's just been dumped in their lap, and so the new subtypes are probably going to mirror the fair market value, or the RUR subtypes. So you won't have this thing where they're ignoring the fact that there's no timber on property and treating it as if there were. That would only apply for that exemption, that forest land protection exemption. Remember I said earlier, this new method of valuation is not an exemption, so therefore they're going to be valuing it. If part of it's open, they're going to value it as open land. If part of it's in timber, they're going to value it as timberland. And right now we have these different digest classes: agricultural, commercial, exempt. Y'all have all seen that. There's going to be a new digest class with a new letter that represents that digest class, and that's something they haven't worked out yet. So it could be, you know, L or Z or M or whatever, but there will be a new digest class. I'll pass that along to y'all as soon as I get more information. The residential parcels are not going to change at all, and they have a subtype of res. Now, we call them residential just because they have that RES abbreviation, but this actually applies to commercial parcels. It applies to industrial parcels. It's basically anything that's not valued as using those subrecords. So if it's a subdivision and it's valued per lot, there's going to be a subdivision of code that's in that table. It's going to say code 203 is Oak Ridge subdivision, and the parcels in there are valued at $50,000 per lot, or they're valued at, you know, $15,000 per acre, or they're valued based on their the amount of frontage they have on, say, a lake or a river. And that's, like I said, that's something that y'all probably all seen. And just know that residential can be a little misleading term there. It could be industrial, but they're typically going to value those as, if you've got an industrial park, they're going to call that an industrial subdivision and put a value per acre or a value per whatever. If it's commercial, they're probably going to do the same thing. They're going to say downtown central business district, and we're going to value that based on how much frontage those parcels have on the street. All right, so now that we've gone through all that, how do you calculate the market value? If you go to the real prop table, these fields have been in WinGAP for a while. I want to say probably about 6, maybe 5 or 6 years. It sure does make life a lot easier when you go to one place. There may be 2 houses on this parcel, and this is just the value of both of those houses added together. And there may be, you know, a garage and a tennis court and a swimming pool, and that would be just the value of all 3 of those added together for that parcel. Now, this curval is the entire value for the parcel. And if you want to get to the fair market value of the land, you just add the value of the improvements together. You take the total parcel value, subtract the residential structure, subtract the accessory structures, and this is how you come to the fair market value of the land. All right? Pretty straightforward. how do you calculate the conservation use values if that parcel was in conservation use? Well, back to this land subs table. There's a field called rural value. Now, if this was residential parcels, there's another field called urb value, which means urban value. And you should never have a parcel that has a number in both fields. All right. I think that would make WinGAP choke. I don't think you'll ever have to worry about running across that. But so if I go in here and just summarize all the values in these subrecords, you see how they all have the same real key. These are the conservation use values. I didn't select the rural values that are associated with this parcel, and just calculated the sum of those. That's the taxable value. That's not the fair market value. We had got that from the real prop table. This is the taxable value with the exemption applied. And if you've ever heard people just moan and groan about conservation use just destroying their digest, well, this is an example. This is a real-life example from McDuffie County. They had a fair market value of $928,000. The exemption of $775,000 because of the way they valued this. They're valuing it based on the production of what is the income value, the value of the income that's derived from that property, whether I'm growing pine trees or peaches or tomatoes or wheat or whatever. They looked at several different commodities to come up with the income, the value of that land based on the income it produces. So it leaves you with a taxable value of $152,000 instead of $928,000. Multiply that times 40%. So fair market value, you've heard of fair market value and assessed value. This is fair market value, $152,000. Assessed value is simply 40% of that. Somewhere way back in time, the legislature thought that it would sound better if you told taxpayers, well, you're only taxing on 40% of the value of your property. But that just increases the millage rate. So it doesn't really affect the taxes at all. It just throws another calculation in the mix. 25 mills, which is probably pretty average. I haven't actually sat down and done a study to see what the average millage rate is across the state, but I would call that average. And so your assessed value times the millage rate equals your tax bill. So they paid $1,500. They saved $9,200, or they as opposed to $9,200, they saved $7,700 by having that parcel in conservation use. Now, if they breach their covenant, they have to pay twice that amount back. So let's say they go out there and they have pasture land and they put it in a covenant, and then they cut off a couple of acres and sell it to somebody that they're not related to. Then they're going to have to pay back $14,000. They can sell land to a family member that's, I think, first cousin or closer, and that's pretty much the only way they can transfer property out of these covenants. Like I told you earlier, forest land protection, that exemption would not apply to Farmer Brown with his 500 acres. There again, that would be an exemption that would be available to large timber companies. And by the way, people, this was on the ballot in 2014, I believe. And once again, the people of the state voted themselves a tax increase, gave the large timber companies a break. So it's easy to see why landowners want to put their property in these covenants, whether it's Kuva or Flipper, either one. And they're shifting the tax burden to the people that have those RES parcels, or the ones that have the AG parcels. Some people have agricultural land that for whatever reason, they either don't want to put it in conservation because they're not sure what they're going to do with it in 3 years, or they're a corporation that is not necessarily, you can have a family-owned farm corporation that would be eligible, but if you have two unrelated people that form an LLC and buy some property, they're not eligible for this tax break. Another really big thing about what's going on in WinGAP, some changes. They've done away with the old sketch module that they had. This was something that we actually wrote at ITOS back in about, 1999. It's been a long time, and there's a company called Apex. They provide software to people in the insurance industry, sketch software to private appraisers that do mortgage appraisals, and a whole bunch of other people. And it's pretty slick. You can basically click on a point and tell it, you can either use your mouse to draw a line, and it'll tell you how long that line is, or you can type in the length of that line and the software will draw it for you. And then you can, click an arrow to the right or to the left and type in another number, it'll draw that line. So this is these sketches that y'all have all seen. You've seen the process that we came up with to convert those to building footprints and put them in your GIS. And the big thing, they had some counties that were saying, one thing that software won't do, you can't draw round walls. So not many counties, I know from working in Morgan County, there were probably 2 buildings in the whole county that had round walls. And we came up with a workaround for it. It was kind of clunky looking, but you could go up a foot and out a foot, and it looked like a sort of more of a stair-step design than it did a true arc. But this software will handle true arcs. It'll let them create these arcs. And so I'm guessing that in most counties that's going to probably be far less than 1% of the buildings. But that's just from, I wouldn't call that an educated guess. I'd just say that's just from being, observing things. This data is going to be stored the same way. If you've worked with the table called WG Sketch, you've seen how that data is organized. It's a series of, I think it's comma delimited XY pairs for each vertex in the sketch, each corner of the building. And it's going to still be stored in that WG Sketch file, but the 1% or less of those buildings that have arcs, we're not sure if we're going to be able to convert those to building footprints with the tools that we currently that we're currently using. We may be able to find something else out there. I haven't even looked at it because I haven't gotten any of this data yet. And so what we're talking about, I know a lot of it I've said that they're going to do this, but I don't know what it's going to look like, and they're going to do that, and I don't know how they're going to do it. But they, bless their hearts, they're still trying to figure it out themselves, and they've had, I guess in the last 2 years, they've probably had, 3 or 4 of the people that actually work with the tax assessors leave. I guess most of you have probably heard of a company called GMAS that goes into these counties and does a complete revaluation, and in some cases they're working. I know Hall County, they've actually embedded some of the GMAS employees into the assessor's office as day-to-day workers. They're basically contract employees. And GMAS is just getting bigger and bigger, and they started doing parcel maintenance. They've started doing personal property appraisal, audits and appraisals, and of course they have a big team that does real estate valuations, and so DOR is really struggling right now. They need some good people. If y'all know somebody that's in a county that is pretty sharp and is looking for a move, I'm sure they would appreciate a call. Other WinGAP features. They've developed an income module. There are 3 approaches to value. You have the cost approach where you say, all right, I've got this land that I know is worth $50,000, and I'm going to spend $100,000 putting a building on it, so it should be worth $150,000. That's the theory. Doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it's worth a little more. Sometimes it's worth less, depending on a lot of variables. You also have the market approach to value, which is the one we're most familiar with. That's where you go out and you have a house, for example, or a piece of property, a house, and it's in a subdivision, and most of the houses are very similar in size and quality and construction, quality of construction and design. and you have 3 of them that sold, and one of them sold for $150,000, another one sold for $160,000, and one of them sold for $155,000. So you say, all right, what's my subject house worth? And you go in and make slight adjustments for this and that. If one's a little bit bigger, you might adjust it downward. If one's a little bit smaller, you might adjust it upward. But you look at the sales of similar properties in order to determine the value. The third approach to value is the income approach. That's where an investor would look and say, all right, we've got a duplex here, and I'm getting $500 a month rent from each unit, and they look at, they develop a capitalization rate, the rate of return of value and return of investment, and then they calculate how much income they're going to be able to pull off of that after they service the debt and maintenance and any other expenses. And they look at that final number, and this is how much money I can walk away with each month or each year in my pocket. And then they determine what is the current value of that dollar that I'm going to get next year and the year after and the year after. And that's actually the amount that a smart investor would pay for a piece of property. They're also going to compare real estate to things like T-bills, different other things that they can invest in, and they're going to say, well, am I smart to buy that duplex, or would I be better off investing in some other type of, not real estate, some other type of investment? And so real estate's in competition from that perspective with other, I don't know, not commodities, but other investment types. And up until now, WinGAP has not had the ability so they didn't have any tools built in WinGAP. You couldn't put in a cap rate and a market rent amount and expenses and all this and have it spit out a number. But now it does. And I know that's probably boring. It's all get out to y'all. But you're going to start seeing data that's going to say, all right, these are the parcels that were valued using the income approach, and these were the ones that were valued using what they call what is really a market modified, a cost modified market approach, where they're looking at saying what they do now is they go out and they basically do the cost approach, where they take the land and the cost of construction, and then they say, all right, let's compare that, the number we came up with here, to sales. And they'll say, all right, well, in this market, the cost approach comes up 3% short. So we're going to adjust all our numbers and our cost to come up with something that matches what we see in the market. All right. Let's see. They also have a feature where they can go in, and this is probably going to be interesting to several of y'all. And it's something that you at least need to know about if you're doing parcel maintenance for a county and you're waiting on, you're doing splits and they're assigning the parcel numbers, which is really the way it should be. If you're doing splits, if I were doing splits for a county, I wouldn't want to be the one that assigned the parcel number, because that's where things get out of track. But this will allow them to go in and select a parcel that's being split. Let's say something that's got 50 new parcels, and they're all half an acre, and they're all going to be selling, valued at $50,000. They can go in and take the parent parcel and put in the number of new parcels, the size of those new parcels, and the value of those new parcels, and click a button, and it'll say, take parcel map 10, parcel 27, and it's going to say there's, 27-1, 27-2, 27-3, all the way up to 50. And they just created 50 parcels at one time, which is, in a rural county, you're probably going big deal. But in a larger county, somebody in the assessor's office sees that, they're going to say, oh, wow, that's great. And even if they're valuing those something other than a per lot basis, let's say they're valuing it on a per acre basis, they don't have to go in and create those new parcels. All they have to do is, after they're created, is go in there and put in the appropriate acreage. So it's a lot less data entry for them. But as you can imagine, anytime you're doing anything in bulk like that, You can either do it right and save a lot of work, or you can do it wrong and mess up a lot of things. And so they're probably going to be some counties that are hesitant to use this just because they're afraid. That's, I guess, the best way to say it. They don't want to mess that things up. So this, you know, the question that I get all the time is, I have a side note here that if you can also put in parcels that don't have an acreage. So if you were valuing these on a per lot basis, you could say, I got 50 new parcels. I'm not putting in any acreage. I'm just going to put them on as, you know, $50,000 per lot. Which I know that y'all probably seen this, and I know I get a lot of questions from people that don't really understand the process. They'll go, how can you have a parcel with no acreage? Well, they're not concerned about whether it's 0.5 acres or 0.52 acres. It's still a $50,000 lot. So they can care less what the acreage is. I suggest that if you're doing parcel maintenance for a county that's taking advantage of this new feature, sit down and talk to the people about it, so that, you know, like I said, it's something that can be a real work saver, or it can be something that can really cause a lot of mistakes. So I'm going to give the screen back to Rachel, and we can have questions.
Jimmy.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? This is Brent.
Hey, Brent.
I've got a couple of, hey, Jimmy. I've got a couple of questions. So you mentioned at the onset that Jim Thomas is not at DOR, and of course we know Greg Reese hasn't been there for a while. Are both those guys still active on the WinGAP group?
Yeah, you know, as you're aware, as I mentioned, you know, Greg Reese was one of the founding people at this GMAS company. He and his wife started that company. And so he's working for GMAS, but he has a personal contract with the WinGAP group. And so, yeah, he is available, I guess, until he gets ready to completely retire. You know, and Tracy is also working for GMAS, so I'm assuming that the same applies for him, that, you know, that he will be available as well as a GMAS employee.
Okay. And then just the next question, and I'll turn it over to others, is so a lot of us that are doing parcel maintenance provide some ancillary services like Kuva and Flipper analysis. Based on these new changes to WinGAP, are we going to need to revisit our scripts, you think, to update them based on the new production values?
Not for just the Kuva and Flipper calculations. And actually, I don't think what you're going to do is you're still having you're having to calculate the rural values whether the parcel's in Flipper or not, right? And of course, conservation isn't going to change. The difference is going to be that you might have a parcel that's owned by Union Camp, for example, that is valued by the state. So you're going to have a group of subrecords in that land subs table that says, you know, these are the state values. You're going to have a group of parcels in there that RUR values. This is the fair market value the county assigned, which may be different from what the state assigned. And then you're going to have Flipper. So it won't change the structure of that table. It's just going to add additional records. Now, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure I'm sure somebody's thought of this before, but let's say they breached that covenant, and the calculations that I showed you earlier, where you have to pay back twice what you saved. I don't know if they'd use the state value to calculate that or the local value. That really doesn't concern you. I mean, I know, but it's just a
philosophical question, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate it. That's really the two main questions I had. I'll turn it over to the other folks. Thank you.
You're welcome. I told you it was going to be real nerdy.
Hey, Jimmy, this is Hunter.
Hey, Hunter.
Hey, was the only reason for the parcel request for timber?
The reason, say that again?
So when the Department of Revenue asked for these parcels, was that strictly for timber? Did that have multiple purposes besides just timber?
No, it's just timber. This was something that was lobbied for by the large timber companies and got passed. It was a constitutional amendment. We all voted. I voted against it personally, but the rest of the state voted this in. So it was definitely a specific to that industry tax break for big timber.
And is it an annual request or is it a one and done request?
This will be the way they value those parcels, those timber parcels, until there's something to remove that constitutional amendment, and you know how hard that would be. So I think this is something we'll see, in perpetuity.
The second question I have is there was also a request, and it's been about 9-10 months ago, from the Department of Revenue regarding tax districts and center lines. That was a one and done request, to my understanding, for car taxes. Do you know anything about that?
I know more than, I know a lot about that. I've had some conversations with the president of GATO, which is the Tax Commissioners Association, and all the tax commissioners are just in a tizzy about this. And what they've done is somebody without any knowledge of GIS, without any spatial concept, came up with this bright idea. We'll use road center lines because, hey, if not call comes in at 911, they can find out right where that address is. And if we know where that address is, then we can determine whether it's in or outside the city limits. But they didn't think about irregular annexation, where you have one parcel that's on one side of the road that's in the city, and all the parcels on the other side of the road are in the city, but everything that touches that one parcel is outside the city limits. So I said, you're going to have to break those center lines everywhere there's a change. Everywhere where there's a change. So they hadn't thought about that. I got a call from DOR after the GATO president called them and said, you need to call Jimmy because this is not working. And I explained all this stuff to them, and Hunter, quite frankly, I think a lot of it went over their heads. And I said, you've got some places where there's annexation that's, a parcel that didn't want to be annexed, and they went around them, so it looks like Swiss cheese. Rachel, I think you've got a few of those in Valdosta, don't you? You've got parcels where one side of the road is one city and the other side is another in Remerton. There are all kinds of things that really make working with centerline data not a good source for this type of project. It'd be much better if they had address points, right? The point's either in the city or it's out, right? But they didn't do that. They didn't ask anybody, and they just got a mess. I think the problem that they have now is they've invested too much time and money in this before they figured out that they had a problem, and they don't know how to get back out of that. But
one final question, a little bit different, is explain to me the process. I mean, you live in timber. That's not exactly the heartburn I hear from the tax assessors of really small counties. The heartburn I hear from them is that they see logging trucks going up and down their roads all the time, and they're almost 100% sure that they're not fully getting the value of what's being cut. And they're not comfortable, they're not sure how to get that value and know exactly how a timber company is successfully reporting what they're cutting.
Right. Well, a lot of counties, and there's not a cut and dry solution for that problem, first of all. They've just got to be diligent. And if the county doesn't have a permitting process for for harvesting timber, they need to have one. There's also a guy named Charles Bailey that works with the Georgia Forestry Commission that's been doing some change detection work using Landsat imagery. And I think he's on a 6-month cycle. So he's gone through and determined for a completely different purpose. This doesn't have anything to do with taxes, but he's created a feature class that he updates regularly of all the places where there was a change. So there were trees here 6 months ago, now they're not. And they'll gladly share that data with the counties. Now, then you just do a simple overlay analysis, and we see which parcels intersect those change polygons. And then you take that list over to the tax commissioner's office and determine which ones paid the taxes and which ones didn't.
Could you share that with me, that guy's contact?
Charles Bailey, let me see. I have his contact. You want me to just email that to y'all?
Yeah, otherwise I was going to segue into our next presentation about drones. We were looking at, flying some of these, but I think it's too labor intensive to visit a permit site, fly it, and do acreage off of drone flight. That still requires hourly.
I mean, you'd have to cover the whole county, and permitting and I don't think that's feasible, but.
Not the whole county, just where the permit was pulled. What the assessment is not that they're not getting the permit, that everybody's underreporting, from the person who pulls the permit to the person who cuts to the person who's driving the truck, to however they're reporting, everybody's shaving. And that there's not a...
And I believe them too, Hunter. I believe I think they're losing a lot of revenue there. Do you know Doug Miles up in Bacon County? He was kind of a pilot with using this data that Charles has, and I don't know what results he got. I mean, he asked me to do the overlay, and I did, and I sent him a list. I just sent him a spreadsheet, and these are the names and parcel numbers of the people that had some kind of change on their property. And I asked him to get back with me, and he never did. But, I mean, he may have looked at every one of them and said, they all paid their taxes. Or he may have looked at all of them and said only 50% of them paid their taxes. I don't know. But I have no doubt that they're losing with that revenue. And I just sent you Charles Bailey's contact information.
You're everywhere.
Now, I have no idea, you know how things go with funding, and I haven't talked with Charles in a while. The last time I talked to him, he said this was something they were going to continue to do as long as they had funding. So.
Thank you, Jimmy. I think we need to go ahead and wrap things
Welcome.
up. We've got about 5 minutes before our next presentation is supposed to start, but we really appreciate you speaking with us today and telling us all about the WinGAP update.
You're welcome. Wish I could be down there with y'all.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Jimmy.